Welcome to today's episode of the Gem Club podcast. I am your host, Adam Lehman. On today's episode, we were able to have the founders of The Darkest Horse, Rada and Chanté, join us for a conversation about all of the things that The Darkest Horse does. The Darkest Horse is a minority and woman-owned next-gen DEIA consulting firm. They're obsessed with helping the workforce and organizations explore the intersections of radical inclusion, emerging technology, the future of work, health, well-being, and human potential. They talk about all these things in today's episode. The Darkest Horse partners with organizations to help them remain competitive while empowering diverse talent to thrive. They're fascinating people living in a fascinating space in today's world that's making a lot of social change, but also just moving the world into the future. And they're helping large and small organizations do that. And they share very practical tips about how to approach and think about DEIA work. They even give a framework about the letters and sort of the way to approach all of those. I'm so excited for you all to get to hear from them. It was a wonderful conversation. I could have talked to them for a very long time, and you could tell that there's so much more to get into than what we were able to even cover on today's episode, but it's a great start. Also want to remind everybody before we get into it to visit thegemclub.com. On that site, you'll learn a lot more about our private membership community and all things the Gem Club. Let's get into it today with Rada and Chanté. Here we go. Chante, Rada, welcome to the Gem Club podcast. So excited to have you both on here. As we get into it, why don't you both introduce yourselves a little bit and start by giving us sort of a working definition. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing, and then we'll get into some of the questions that we've got for you.
Awesome. I'll kick us off. This is Rada. I use she, her pronouns. I am one of the two co-founders of The Darkest Horse. And I identify as a queer, cis, white, mostly able-bodied, I'm actually hearing impaired woman, and native English speaking, educated in the U educational system. Just a few of the important facts that we sort of like to start our conversations that way, right? Because I think it's really important, and you'll see as we keep talking about this stuff, it's really important, the lenses, the perspectives, the worldviews, the experiences that we sort of carry with us. Nothing is an absolute fact. And so it's really about what the filter it's going through is. And I'll start with some definitions maybe, and then maybe I can hand it over to Chanté and she can intro and say some more. And so I'll start with DEIA, which are the letters that we type in all caps a lot. And so that's diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And I'll do sort of like super short. Diversity is really about representation, right? It's about having a lot of different types of folks in the room across various sort of intersecting identities. So it's really about the like numbers that make up the like demographics in the space. Equity is about sort of fairness, right? And we often distinguish between equity and equality, right? Where equality is that everybody gets the same thing, and equity is sort of everybody gets what they need to make things sort of evened out, right? And so when we start talking about existing systems of inequity, that's why equity matters, right? Is because like the scales are a little bit tilted. And so not everybody needs exactly the same thing to get the same opportunities. So equity is about kind of balancing those scales a little bit. And then when we say inclusion, we're really talking about like not just having the folks in the room, but actually like listening to them, right? and meeting them and supporting them and saying like, you know, there's this dance metaphor that folks use where they're like, you know, diversity is inviting everybody to the dance and inclusion is playing the music that everybody likes to dance to, right? And so that's really about, and we talk about radical inclusion. We say like, it's not just about like getting everybody to kind of fit in. It's about saying, ooh, what's different about you that's different from everybody else in this space? And how do we really celebrate and elevate, not just accept and tolerate, but like activate and celebrate that specific thing. And then that last letter, A, accessibility, is really about access, right? How do they actually access resources? How do we actually show up? How do we get into the literal physical room? How do we use technology? How do we do stuff like that? And the last thing I'll say about that is that we actually don't use that order. We actually start with accessibility. We say, If you can't access it, if people can't show up, you're sort of out of luck, right? It's a non-starter. And then once folks are there, we say, okay, equity and inclusion. How do we make sure that the folks who are here are actually being celebrated, are actually being given what they need, are actually like having the resources and the support and the structure and the culture that makes them actually able to like be a part of this team, a part of the system. And we don't really talk about diversity. We say diversity is a lagging metric. Diversity is the consequence of what happens if you do accessibility, inclusion, and equity correctly. You end up with a sense of belonging. You end up with a lot of different folks staying. They come to the party. If you build it, they come. They come to the party, they stay at the party, you end up with a really cool group of folks. And that's sort of, we have a whole thread of work where we say that we're banning the D word. And that's sort of what we mean, is that we think that people get a little bit too tunnel vision on that demographic piece, that numbers game, recruiting folks, stuff like that, when really that ends up being a lost effort if you're not already doing those other three parts correctly. So that's sort of a little bit of foundation. I'll stop talking for a bit, and I want to hear from Chante too.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Chante, Martinez, Thurmond. My pronouns are she, her, and Aya. I'm in Chicago, like Rada, and I show up as a mixed race, actually Black Latina identifying woman. Another really important identity that I will likely bring, or you will hear, is that I'm a mother. So you might hear me scream at my kids or take a pause. I'm a mother of twins, so that's even more specific. It's fun being a mother of multiples, but also really complicated, especially in the pandemic. And in terms of just like other things about me that I think are really important, and I try to think about or bring to my lens, is like I'm a woman who, like as an entrepreneur, I struggle with, I have ADHD, so neurodiversity, and some of the things that we can't see in terms of like folks with limitations or other abilities. I'm often thinking about especially when it comes to accessibility, like it's really important that we make sure folks can have equity in the conversation. So Rada, you did such a great job of explaining all of that to everyone. Thank you. And I just want to say, yes, we are absolutely like a huge underscore banning the D word. In fact, one of the things I like to say is if you could just put diversity over here, like just stop using that word. What else would you call it? And it's like, that's actually the work, because it's interesting how people will say, oh, I have a diversity candidate. And I'm like, what does that mean? And they're like, oh, I mean a Black candidate. I'm like, okay, say that, or we want to add a little diversity to this club. And we're like, well, what kind of diversity are you looking for? Like, I'm looking around, they're like, oh, we don't have any folks from the LGBTQ community. I'm like, okay, say that, because the more specific we can get, the better. And actually we can stop like kind of playing around the bush, beating around the bush. We can actually just get to the heart of what we need to do. So we're very triggered by that word. We feel it's kind of like if we continue to perpetuate and let folks say that we're playing into the performative allyship that folks are really showing up hard with these days. As a firm, what we do in terms of the Darkest Horse is we call ourselves the next gen DEIA. So we have the D there, but we're going to get rid of it soon. So we call ourselves a next gen firm. And we're focusing on radical inclusion, the future of work, emerging technology, and then health, well-being, and human potential. We love our website, by the way, Adam. Thank you all, your team, for helping us build it. It's been like, we just love the remake and the facelift that we have. It means
Allie and Matt are skilled practitioners with a lot of reps, and the two of you brought really good collaborator energy to that one. And I remember when Matt was sharing it with us, and everybody on our team just sort of like lost our mind a little bit collectively of like, whoa, this is really cool and unique. And it's beautiful. This doesn't need to be like, we didn't invite you here to talk about how wonderful Matt are.
No, but we have to plug. I mean, Thank you so much. It's amazing. Yeah.
You have a very some of the things that you just talked about are included in more information on that website. So if somebody's trying to hear you articulate more, wants to see more resources, that's a good spot to go searching for sure. Dan.
Yeah. So, I totally agree with the diversity piece, where it's like kind of just like a euphemism for like whatever the person's really trying to say, right? Like you said, Black or LGBTQ. And you see a lot of the window dressing with companies at the moment trying to be more diverse. Have you guys seen, or excuse me, have you ladies seen companies more eager to take on work, or like have you seen an uptick in inquiries about like how do we now get money from other demographics that we may have been ignoring?
Yes. Everybody discovered that racism is a thing about a year and some change ago.
I'm so glad it didn't exist when I was younger, or when my mom
Yeah,
But I
was.
want
thank
to,
goodness.
but I want to say, I do want to say something about that, right? Because I feel like I was going to say yes and no. Like there's been a huge interest, and I feel that especially after the murder of George Floyd, when the Black community, like we had already been organizing. If you're a Black person listening to this, we've been organizing. We've had to do it underground. We've had to do it above. Like we were most recently able to do it kind of out loud and stuff.
Yes, ma'am.
But it's been here the whole time. And what's made the difference, I think, most recently is that we had non-Black people join loudly in the marching, in the protesting, in the demands for justice and for fairness in all like realms of our life. And so it was interesting to me because I was like going to different places, and I mean, thankfully somebody like Rada, who is woke and very well informed and already an activist, like I didn't have to go and try to activate her. She was already, that's how we got together and started working together. But so many other people, white people in my life, were like, oh my God, I had no clue this existed. I'm like, how the hell did you not know that this existed? And I have to understand that answer when you say that. Like, I'm so shook right now that you don't know that this was a thing. Like, that was very upsetting to me, actually. As a person who grew up in the Midwest, I grew up in Iowa. But so most of my friends, I'm like in predominantly white spaces my whole life. Most of my friends, I'm like the one solid Black person tokenized friend that they had. They're like, oh yeah, Chante, go to her for all the Black experiences. Um, and so I'm like, so all those years of me being a token, you still don't know what the hell's going on? Like what, so I was feeling some type of way. And,
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Rada.
Yeah, no, it's what I hear you pointing to, and I think you're right. What I should have said is, yeah, white people just figured out that racism is a thing. And I think what you're pointing to is when we think about people, and I think this is actually really important for this particular work, is thinking about individuals, right? And individual experience, individual awareness, individual behaviors and beliefs, groups and communities, systems and cultures, and like organizations, right? And when we think about like how this kind of evolution and how this kind of awareness happens as movements, right? We think about like civil rights movements. We think about like how culture, community, behaviors, norms change. Power is a big part of it, right? And so where we see these, like if you were going to plot like a heat map of like wokeness and activation and stuff like that, you would start seeing really different pockets light up than where necessarily like authority and money live, right? And so it's really, a lot of this is about sort of seeing that flow. It's almost like like water currents, right? Of like where you can see where the patterns are shifting and like where we can flow it, where we can redirect from what language already does exist, what culture exists, what movies, what books, what history, we can actually leverage to like get what we need, get the flow in the right direction in a sense. And so, yeah, so I really appreciate it. That's why we call it a movement, right?
For sure.
Yep. Yes. It has been a movement. And the thing is that what I've seen in terms of it, like from the streets into the corporations, and this is where we, have play a unique role because we are always going to be in the streets. I think it's just our personalities. Like we make sure we in the streets, we have to be, because that's actually what keeps us woke and like, and actually very grounded and centered, is to like understand what's happening, in the non-corporate spaces. I think that actually is one of our gifts, because we talk a lot about just the future of work, and you can find out what's happening by staying on the fringes, and kind of being able to trend set and, trend spot by having a close ear to the ground and stuff. So we're really good about doing that. What we saw and noticed was that like all of a sudden these corporate, relationships we have just blew up, and they were definitely coming to us. We were so grateful. And the thing is that the folks who, and I think this might be something we can get into a little bit later. I don't want to overspeak it now, but I just feel that like we saw all these different things come together at the same time. And it was interesting with COVID being a factor of that, where people, we know this to be true, that people actually had time. They were like, okay, I got time. I got time to go to the streets. I got time to write that extra little email to my CEO, and I'm going to do it. And then I saw that that was like a thing happening where folks were starting to, they wrote letters, they started to publish those letters or threads of that on Twitter, on Instagram, said, this is what I wrote, this is what I did at our organization. And people were like, ooh. And I think it had been any other time that folks wouldn't have had the ability to like pay attention online. And they started to apply pressure in a way that wasn't like there before. And it was because the white allies, the non-Black people, had time, interestingly enough. So when we talk about the future of work and we talk about being pre-programmed and occupied by all of these like things with like this hustle culture, that's a part of it, So I just want to make sure that we talk about that a little bit, because I think all those things had to be true in order for us to see the uprising and the demand for change this last year. Whether or not it's actually going to happen is a whole nother story.
Yes, I would agree that that kind of pause we had was wonderful, because not only did we have time, like we had time to like unravel how covert the racism is now as opposed to like overt. You know what I mean? So you start teaching people about microaggressions, and we've seen some different laws about like you can't fire me because of how I wear my hair and things like that. So it's been a really interesting time, and it was almost like surreal for a second. Maybe like that first week, I'm like, I am almost certain like things will go back to how they were. And like I said, it was very surreal at first, but now it's very warm and welcoming. It's like, this is nice.
Yeah, it was. Chante, you bring up white people had time and were activated, started doing something that a lot of other people have been doing for a long time. And I saw that in conversations with friends like D'Angelo. That was the first sentiment, I've never seen white people care like this before. Like that was what was new. And then a number of clients who we work with, we became like, and we help people with branding and messaging and even things that show up on their websites and how they present themselves to the world. And so we were part of a lot of conversations at that time and talking to a lot of white people about like what to do that your employee just sent you one of those emails. Like, how do you respond to all of this? And it was wonderful to have, resources and peers and other people like yourselves to kind of help learn from and help to like give out that information. Cause it takes, it's just the two of you. It needs a lot more than just two people doing all the work.
We've got a family. We've got a whole,
Yeah, but it's it's an incredible thing. If you're a person listening to this, imagine if someone's sitting here and listening that's like, I love these things. I felt activated myself and I want to do something with it. I want to do this work. How did the two of you get to this spot where this is the work that you're doing, where you're busy bringing about and helping other people sort of facilitate these changes in this movement? And maybe walk us through how you got where you got to.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think because one thing that I also wanted to throw in related to what the conversation we were just having is like, I think a really important part, and this is also part of this answer, a really important part is our sort of cultural ability to do what I call like zooming in and out, right? And I think that historically a lot of racism was understood as like an individual behavior, right? That like, I'm not racist because I don't do these like really bigoted, overt, to your point, things. And that we're starting to actually understand how systems work, and like collectively we're like culturally sort of understanding, all becoming a little bit more of systems thinkers, where we say, oh, it's not just about a bunch of individuals doing stuff. It's about like how our rules are set up and how our collective, experiences, like how like our epigenetic ancestral sort of passed down things like impact our behavior in our time and space now. And so I think that's actually also part of my personal journey here, right? Is like, as an out queer woman and my background has always been in really corporate contexts. I've worked in healthcare and technology firms, and I've always worked sort of in the business. I have my MBA, I've worked in like data science and operations and product innovation and sort of strategy and growth and stuff like that. And those are some of those deeply institutionalized, deeply normative, not diverse, not inclusive, not equitable, and not very accessible spaces. And through various combinations of privilege and resource and luck and all of that, I was in there, right? And I was one of the very few queer out women. And that made me naturally a role model, right? Naturally highly visible, naturally sort of witnessed. And like, what does that mean, right? And thankfully I'm an enthusiastic Gemini and very extroverted. So like I was fine with that spotlight. and so my work really started, I would say kind of twofold. One is for LGBTQIA plus identifying folks, right? It was like I did a lot of inclusion for queer identifying folks, especially in healthcare, and thinking about like and especially sort of how do we create trans inclusive healthcare services, right? Because it's a huge problem. It's extremely harrowing and there's a lot of opportunity there. And there was just like, that's what I started doing. And the other piece was like, I was leading teams. And I've always been a person who loves people who are different from me. I've always had this like, and again, call it privilege, call it, where I was raised, the fact that both my parents are artists, and like difference is where art comes from, right? And so I was just always excited about that. So I was building these teams where I wasn't just like okay with people being different. I was actually like thrilled by the differences among the people on my team. And it turns out that when you do that, people trust you more. They collaborate better, they communicate better, they take better risks, and then they get better solutions and they have more creative ideas, and the outcomes are better. And so I was just sort of like doing that. And again, getting seen and witnessed and like observed, and then turned that into intentional work, right? Started actually training on it, started actually like doing that in my organization and with other organizations. And that was when I was kind of doing all that thought leadership work, not just for LGBTQI plus folks, but sort of broadly, people who don't share my identities, but share that experience of being different. And that's when I found Chante. And we were both sort of like doing this like thought leadership, evolutionary work that overlaps, but is different because we're different. And we found a lot of like comfort in the values that we share and like excitement and possibility in the parts where we're really different, and both got really excited about that. So that was how this all started. And I think that, and I think it is a lot of that is that like balance between like, what's my individual accountability and role and how do I influence systems, right? How I'm part of bigger systems that also need to be held accountable and need to be evolving.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Chante, I was going to ask you, but it's just beautiful to see the work that you're doing now, that through line of how we got to where we are now it's just natural to listen to you talk to. It just sort of flows smoothly. Chante, talk a little bit about how you got into doing the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, thank you. So I was gonna say similar to Rada, where it's like, we, because of the identities that we hold, and for me, I'll just say it again, that I identify as a Black Latina. I grew up in Iowa, and yes, there are Black people there, and yes, there are Latinos there. It just so happened that my parents were like one of the maybe one, if not two, weird, odd folks who like were a Mexican in Black household. Most of the other mixed kids were like white and Black, so that was unique for me. But I grew up in the middle of the country, and I think because I was involved in lots of different things, I was always involved in sports, always involved in clubs and all kind of extracurricular activities. I quickly became the tokenized, like, other person in the circle, and that elevated me in ways that I was okay with. But I think with that sort of spotlight comes responsibility, and I always knew that as a young person. And I think that luckily I had some people who kind of shepherded me down these paths of saying, like, if you have, that you have like this gift, do something positive with it, because there's a lot of harm you could do too. And so I was like intentional about getting involved with things in high school and in college. I really got activated, did a lot of organizing. And then in my professional world, that started to spill like right over naturally into it. My first job, and I went to nursing school, by the way. my first job out of nursing school was at Planned Parenthood. I was a clinic manager, and working at Planned Parenthood is a whole nother kind of thing, I believe that, or a situation that actually helped me become the woman that I am today, the leader that I am today, because I faced so much scrutiny and discrimination by working and announcing I worked at Planned Parenthood. I actually went to a Catholic college, and I literally was being questioned. I was sent to the dean's office when people found out that I worked at Planned Parenthood. I thought that was BS. And I was pissed about that. And anyways, so I'm working at Planned Parenthood. I get the job as the clinic manager. And part of that was like talking about identity and sexuality and making sure that when we have patients that came through the door, that we were asking them pronouns. We were like, giving them affirming care. So that really made me like, I had to lean into that. And I really paid attention and said, I love this stuff. I do love this stuff. It's cool that's part of my like gig and it's part of my responsibility. One of the other things that I believe a part of that situation was because I was so young, I was 22 years old, I was literally managing people that were 2 and 3 times my age at that clinic. So I was I would say a natural born leader, lots of the kind of qualities you look for, but I didn't know how to harness that leadership, how to like make it intentional, how to be effective and make people do what I wanted them to do when I wasn't there all the time. So I went back to school, got a graduate degree in organizational development, OD. And since then, I've just basically done like the whole round robin of like OD work, which is starting with change and transformation in the organization. But it's also been, talent acquisition or recruiting. It's been training and development. I've done all things, I guess, except for like benefits, employee benefits. I'm not interested in that. I have some other friends who are really good at that, and it's really technical. And then all those roads led to me getting into the organizational consulting, and diversity, equity, and inclusion was part of that. I think technically, like I would kind of couch this under transformation work because that's what it is. It's sea change. It's like you have to change the culture at these organizations. And really what culture is a mixture of like our beliefs, values, and like the way that we do things. So it's, then you get into like behavioral change too.
Yeah, listen, I'm right there with you. We're pretty deep into it, right? So just kind of shifting gears really quickly, and you had mentioned it briefly about growing up in Iowa, you know what I mean? And like being, that one kid and like, I think of it like this, like the one obvious kid. It's like, well, if you're not black, you're like, obviously not white, right? It's like, so we can ask you a lot of these cultural questions. And for some reason, you'll know the answer to like all the things, right? So, but what were y'all like as kids? Like other than having to be having to bear such a cross. You were responsible for the black community in Iowa, and I as a black person, appreciate that, Chante. So I'll just give you some flowers right now. It was
Thank
years
you.
ago, but we need more people like you.
It's a public service. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks,
like,
D'Angelo. I
out
appreciate
there being
you.
just a serviette. You're like, what? What's a collard green? I have an
Right.
encyclopedia.
Well,
Well,
collard greens, cornbread,
all that. We
right,
love
all
it.
that.
But no,
For me,
seriously. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would say that like my parents would probably, or my family would probably use words like persistent, precocious. I was always told I was very wise as a kid, imaginative, intuitive, and extremely overly optimistic, like to the point where it would drive people crazy, and really into being fair. Like I think I mentioned this before we started recording that I grew up, my brother and I were really close in age. And so if he got something, then damn it, I wanted it too. Or if I was going to get something and he wasn't, I'd be like, that's actually not very fair. And my mom would just be like, oh my God, you and this fairness. She used to tell me like, you'd be a really good lawyer.
Wow.
And I didn't know really what that meant. I was just like, okay, I don't even know how I'm going to become a lawyer, but okay. But yeah, one of the things that I would say my mom, my dad, and just my family, because I had those kind of traits, they would always say like, you can be anything you want to be as long as you put your mind and energy towards it. Because of that ADHD thing, like if I give myself that single pointed kind of like attention, I'm really good at something, but I had my hands in all kinds of different things. So that was what they told me, but I'd be like, yeah, but how? Because I would look around and I didn't have a blueprint around me. Like my parents worked blue collar jobs, and my grandparents, one set was immigrants, the other set, were coming from the segregated South, and they were just definitely blue collar workers. So I didn't know how. I wanted to be successful. I had a lot of like rich, wealthy white friends, and I'd be like, damn, I want that, but I don't know how. And so thankfully, I was one of those kids that had my parents had just enough money to get me into sports, So I played a lot of team sports. I played a lot of basketball. And one of my coaches, Renelle is her name, Renelle Straight, she started a team out there called Team Iowa. It's a really good basketball development program now. But Renelle was so special to me because she saw something in me that I didn't see. And she always told me that I was going to be successful. I was always going to be, that I had the ability to do the things that I didn't think I could. And, she encouraged me to go to college. She encouraged me. I would call her when I got these job opportunities, and she'd always be like, hell yes, you can do that. Like, there's nothing you can't do. And so she would always just say, but you've got to take the action. Like, you got to take the first couple of steps, and you're going to have people like me and behind you. So I think that, those are the things that they would say about me. And, professionally, it has definitely, those experiences, especially being on team sports, has been really, I think, critical to my success. And I know Rada was similarly. So
Yeah,
Rada, please share.
It's amazing that fairness was this nugget, right? Because you sit and you look at teamwork and fairness and how it plays in the worlds that you occupy now, and it's bringing that all to the table. Rada, what about you? What were you like as a kiddo?
Yeah, 100%. And I can verify all of those adjectives that Chante just named. Absolutely persistent, precocious, imaginative, intuitive,
Chante put a nice-
optimistic.
Chante put a nice spin on those. I feel like there's other adjectives that
They all
are more common.
No,
but
they all
that
have
was a
nice.
good one.
All of the adjectives that I would use to describe Chante have beautiful spins on them. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, some of the stuff that she named are some of those really cool areas of similarity. We're both kind of natural born hustlers. We're both the kind of people that when we commit to do the dang thing, like we do the dang thing. Right. And, and they're but really interesting variations on context, right? And like experience. And I think my version, I was extra. I was a lot as a child. Everything I did it hard. I was also a very physically strong baby. I still am a very physically strong human, but as a baby, this was a remarkable quality of mine. I can see that face you're making, Adam, and I'll explain. I'll tell a few little stories. When my dad
If you
had
don't tell a story after introducing I was a physically strong baby,
Yeah.
that demands a story.
There's so many stories.
You're a superhero.
Yeah.
We don't.
Well, as a matter of fact, there's a number. I was such a strong baby that there are many, many famous family stories about this. But one, just an anecdote to help you understand. My dad was an athlete, 3-sport athlete. All of his buddies were football players, rugby players, big dudes. They used to refer to my oldest sister as Princess Labudra was their pet name for her. I was Conan, as in the barbarian. I was just a very strong baby. Before I could walk, I was we had this huge, heavy plastic high chair that you could turn it sideways, and it was like a rocking chair. It was solid. My older sister used to sit in it, and before I could walk, I pushed it around the house like it was a scrum sled. I was a very strong, small person.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and ended up being a rugby player. So yeah, always was a rugby player. Let's be real. But
Wow.
got eventually put on the uniform. And so the story is when I was in the room, and there's any number of those stories, and I think that's still true. It's still I walk in and I'm hard to miss. And a lot of that came with there's a lot of privilege that comes with that, a lot of power that comes with that, right? Where I was okay, I have the security of my safety that I can challenge stuff, right? And I've also, like Chante, love to learn a million things, love to learn a game, a system, a set of rules well enough that I can operate in the rules, but in a way that wasn't intended by the rules, right? And rugby is actually a really perfect example of that. Rugby has a lot of rules. There's a lot of parts that are like very, very tight. Like it's complicated. It's really complex. And I was really good at rugby because I learned all of the rules. And then I was like, ooh. And if when I'm in the scrum, I just like rotate this many degrees in this way, it hits that person's shoulder in a way that like they can't stop me and I can break through, right? Like it becomes a finesse game, even though I'm showing up with that power, like there's finesse in it, right? There's finesse in knowing the precision of the rules. And I think that that's actually a really big piece of how I'm showing up here, right? Is like, I am white, I am US educated, I have an MBA from a very prestigious and therefore, supremacist business school, and like wonderful school as business schools go. And learning all those rules of like how these systems operate meant that I could figure out how to maneuver in it in a way that does finesse that change, right? That is like, okay, cool. These are your rules. And I'm just going to point out how like doing it differently actually achieves exactly what you said you were trying to do, but in a way that also achieves these other things, right? And also knowing when you bend a rule and when it needs to break, right? And when you need to say, actually, this whole system is not right. And like, I know what you were aiming for with these rules, and I'm actually going to leverage the intention of the rules to say we need to change them, right? And we just had, I don't know when this is going to air, but we just passed the 4th of July, and I always read the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, and that's another example of ways where like you got to separate the intention from the rule and figure out like how to use those rules to gain progress and when the rules weren't right in the first place. And the Declaration is a perfect example of both. There's so many parts in there, so many principles in there that I'm like, yes, that's a beautiful type of America. And I would love for us to live up to that dream. The way we're doing it is not quite right. And then there's some parts in there that I'm like, and these parts are wrong. And we know now that those parts are wrong. And we actually have to update those rules and change what that looks like. So I think that that's always been sort of how I show up in a space is like, yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful to hear from both of you. That question is we ask that question of everybody because we only invite people onto this podcast who are doing their thing, but in their own way, in a way that we can see how they're bringing themselves to the table. And what we find from people who listen to this is the amount of, they either experience that where they're like, oh my gosh, I've been doing this. I'm working at a place and I'm spending a lot of my energy and time and effort and whatever in something that doesn't really fit me. Or they find like, wow, I need to create a space for myself that is like uses my whole backlog of experiences and expertise. And, you painted a perfect picture of strong baby through Declaration of Independence and like changing the foundational documents of our country that we live in right now.
Casual connections here.
But it makes sense. It makes it easy because I think whether entrepreneurship or we're talking about accessibility and inclusion and equity, that work requires persistence and time and just banging your head against the wall and speaking up and risking something or causing someone else to have feelings. And it's got to be like whenever you're doing hard work, whether that's creatively or you're pushing social change forward against systems that are built to not change, it just takes a lot of energy. And if you don't have it, if you don't got that coming from, your backlog, then you're in trouble. And it's something I tell entrepreneurs often when I'm working with them through coaching. It's like you got to find like your through line, like your thread, so that you can show up with it when you're tired. And it's beautiful to see both of you showing up.
And that was a legitimate strong baby story. It was measurable. It's not like one of those ones where you like go to the doctor and they're like, your child has a strong trunk.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be that situation. I could do push-ups. I'm like, so?
That's not like, my mom says I'm smart. Like, it's not that type of strong baby.
No.
It's like actionable strength.
Yeah,
it was like,
cool.
hey, open the finger. And you were like, opening beers for you.
Literally.
So we love to hear it.
I love it. So there are a lot of 1 or 2 person businesses who hang out in our ecosystem, and we ourselves are a small team, and there are times that it's been a challenge for us to wrap our mind around what does accessibility or inclusion or equity look like when we're not a team of thousands of people, and we're not necessarily we're hiring from, I've known D'Angelo for a long time, saw a lot of potential. There was like a scenario that worked out. We didn't go through, like we didn't put out application for that position. It wasn't any of those. I just know that that's often the case with small family businesses or one or two person businesses. And how do you talk to folks like that about what they want to do to make a difference?
Yeah, totally. We actually love working with small organizations. And I think a lot of time small organizations think they can't do this work because they think you have to have like a big budget and you have to have a certain number of people to even think about diversity. You're like, oh, if we're only 2 people, we can't possibly have representation of a lot of different identities. And so we're not there yet, right? And I think that there's a few different points that I would kind of poke at in there. I would say that like starting with small organizations is awesome because it's before you've built a lot of bad habits. And so it's a lot easier to set some of those cultural foundations early and grow with them rather than sort of trying to go back and correct for them later on. And I would also say that like, the people have a kind of misconception about the scale of the work, where what I often end up saying is like, even as just an individual, even outside of work, even just like as you move through the world, you actually are making 1 million decisions every day that have the opportunity to either carry on with what has always been done and what you have habituated, right? And what is sort of normative given the kind of systems and assumptions and norms that we have collectively, or to consciously make a different decision on each of those, right? And this goes all the way down to like what kind of toothpaste you buy and whether it supports the prison industrial complex, right? Like there are 1 million of these decisions. And that doesn't mean you have to make every single one of them every single day, but it means there's a whole bunch of options and a whole bunch of opportunities. You can pick the ones that feel the most accessible, the most authentic. Chante and I are constantly talking about like, make the choices that meet your why, like why do you care about this? Why is inclusion important to you? Because that's going to guide you toward the parts that are most important. And like, you don't have to take on the world to make changes. You can just make changes with this base of influence that you have in your work, in your family, in your neighborhood, the school your kids go to, the church you attend, the stores you shop at, like all of those are spaces that you actually do have a lot more voice than you may perceive yourself as having, both indirectly just through your own decisions and by speaking up, right? And I think the other thing that I'll say on that is that like a really, really important part of it is an awareness of what you're up for. And I would even make the what you're up for a little bit more nuanced to say like really discerning what is actually hard, right? And what it actually will cost you. Because I think we sometimes perceive, we have a story that like something's going to cost us a lot more than it actually will. And we don't notice what the actual like benefit's going to be. So for example, I've gotten in the habit, I like made a rule that when another white person says something that feels like a microaggression, not necessarily even against me, but against people of color, against physical ability, against, like all sorts of different things, I have to say something, right? And because I'm doing that happens a lot, so that means I'm doing it a lot. And because I'm doing it so many times a week, it's casual now, right? Like it's not a big production every time. I can just say, I'm sure you didn't mean this, but what you just said kind of came across as blah, blah, blah. I know you didn't mean that. Here's a different way you could say that in the future. You're welcome, right? And then move on about my day. And that people think that that's going to cost you something. They think that's going to risk your relationship. They think that's going to be, a whole thing. And that's an inner system thing, right? That's your system constricting and being afraid of something that actually is going to be fine. And so the ability to kind of like notice that and move through it and say like, I still can do something. I can make this difference and it will have ripples and it will make me better. Each time I get a rep in, I'll be a little bit better at doing it next time.
Rada froze.
Yeah, which I can pick up what she was going to say while she's coming back into the audio here. But so Rada and I are involved in some work with Res Momentum, And, we're both in different cohorts for that work. But the great thing is we talk about getting reps in and building culture with people. And so the thing you can do is that, and to remember, and this is sort of building up what she said as well, is that building culture doesn't take a whole production. It doesn't mean you have to have a 50-person or a 5,000 person company to do that. You can do that with 1 to 2 people, right? You can start to build culture, and then you can scale that culture. It's what's really important, and something that's actually like a life hack or a growth hack for these small businesses is to do it early and often. And then the other thing I want to just tack on here and just to specifically say is that we think about the ecosystems or the circles of influence that we have, and we start there. It's like Rada mentioned, if you're involved with like your children's school, or if you are in graduate school, or if you are, going to one of these entrepreneurial clubs, or even if you're just going to church or wherever you have your spirituality and your faith, those are circles of influence. But even your family, right? Where you can say, this is a role I play in that circle. And this is the way I'm showing up, kind of how we identified ourselves at the beginning, right? And to say how I see it, or how it's landing for me, or some people that I know and I care about, is this. How can we collectively change, or how can somebody in this group change? And I think just doing it and committing to having change for yourself is demonstrative of the ability to do so, and it inspires people. It just takes one.
Yeah.
The other thing here, just to remember, is that like, you can also make a list of like the pros and cons and like the cost benefit analysis, right? And I guarantee you, if you actually walk yourself through that cost benefit analysis of being a beacon of change, you will see that like you get so much more return for actually committing and doing it.
That's beautiful. It's so true. So many things. Yeah, you see that play out so many times inside of work. And there's a lot of things a small business can do, or a tiny business can do, in a lot of spaces they occupy that people look up to. Even people at large organizations at times will be inspired by what smaller organizations are doing. That's how it works often. And so you never know the kind of being intentional. You never know what kind of like ripple effects those have. So I like that kind of advice. It's pretty tangible. It's something that people can do. I'm going to go into the kind of the last question. We'll skip a couple here and just get into like back at the beginning. Give yourself some words of advice at the beginning, what we were saying. We can kind of end on that. Rada, if you're able to hear, you can hop back on if you want to.
I'm here.
Okay,
I'm here.
cool.
I'm so sorry.
That's all good. That's great. I'm going to report it to Zoom. Be like, hey, Zoom, you're like underperforming recently. We need you to improve your performance.
Yes.
Be careful. They'll bug you.
Uh-oh.
You don't want to mess with Zoom.
Okay. Sorry, Zoom. You're great. Love it. Thank you for what you do. If you could go back to when the two of you were starting The Darkest Horse and give yourselves some words of advice, what would those be? And towards the end here, we'll do a rapid fire question. So don't feel free to just give some strong statements to your former selves.
I think I would say, take your time. Like there is this misbelief that like you have to hustle in this work, and I think that there's some truth to that. But I think taking your time and being thoughtful about how you're going to start your business, and like what the first year or two actually looks like, is super important. Like one of the things I learned was that most small businesses owned by women and minorities don't even break $100,000 in terms of income. I didn't know that. Found out the hard way. Wow, what does success mean for us? And if you start to just measure yourself based on like somebody else's success without the context of like, is that the same business? Is that the same clientele? Is that the same startup investment? Is that the same time allocation? You will have like the fear of missing out. You will have that comparison, issue where it becomes the thief of your joy. So allow yourself the time and space to like dream, and then like have realistic, attainable goals for the first like year or two. And if you want, then you can move on to those stretch goals, those big, hairy, audacious goals. And then the last thing is endurance. Like this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. You have to be able to take a few L's because it's the losing that actually makes you better. So It's okay when somebody tells you no. You're going to get told no all the time. So endurance is everything.
Yeah, I love all of that. And I mostly want to just like, yes, underline and agree, which is what I do with Chante a lot of the time. And I think, yeah, that sense of urgency was a thing that was like not super easy to let go of coming out of a corporate context, right? I was like used to constantly sprinting, like constantly. And there's all these stories about how entrepreneurship is even more that way than working in a like quote unquote full-time job. And so I was getting that story from a lot of people of just like, oh, if you're going to start a business, like you're just going to have to be doing that all the time. And that's not true. It's just not true. It's like there's so many ways that that's not true. And I mean, y'all know this. You all are actually a really awesome example of how to do that right, you know, and how to be thoughtful about what a healthy life looks like, and what a good pace looks like. And I think that's been something that's been really, really a journey that I'm continuing to work on, is like how to release that false urgency and not live in that constant demand. And I think, the other things that I want to say to starting us is like actually just affirming all of the stuff that we did right. Like we did so much right. We found people, including and first and foremost each other, that we both had some trust and were intentional in continuing to cultivate that trust and deepen that relationship and be vulnerable with each other and stuff like that. And like not get freaked out by our difference, but instead see that as a huge opportunity. Like there's so much of that stuff that we've done right. And a huge part of it's been letting our path emerge, not trying to predict exactly what we're going to be. Although it's funny, now I have my camera off, but right behind me is the Post-its that we did the first time that we ideated on what the Darkest Horse should be. And they're still on my wall because my dining room was our office. And, they're still true. They're still all true. All of those Post-its is real. And like, we haven't changed. Our values are what we want to do in the world. It hasn't changed, but everything has changed about it, right? Because the world has changed. We have changed. The future has changed. And we have moved with that in a really beautiful flowing way. And I'm like, if I were to go back, I'd be like, you're going to do it right. Like be authentic and do it real, and you're going to do it right.
That's beautiful. If somebody's listening to this and they're just a lot of ideas, they have something they're thinking about, which it sounds like maybe both of you were there, where you're like, you knew what you cared about, but you maybe wouldn't have imagined exactly how it was going to manifest or like show up the way that it is now. If somebody's at that spot where they're just a bunch of ideas, what's something that they're going to hear a lot as they begin this journey that's wrong? Maybe the flip side of this question of like, what are cliches that we hear that aren't really true?
I think similar to what I was saying, like we were oversold on that grind culture and undersold on the opportunity to take rest. And when you rest as an entrepreneur, like whether that is like taking a breather, taking a pause, or just simply getting good, solid 6 to 8 hours of sleep every night, that allows you to like dream. That dreaming is super important, because once you like lose that as an entrepreneur, and that's when like you can't dream your way out of the problem, like, so you're like, oh, I don't know what to do. But that's why it's so important to have that like space for creativity. And I think it's important for like your personal life and then your business life specifically. And I will just plug here that it's really important for Black and women and minority business owners. Like that might be true for white men because of the equity issue, right? Where like, yeah, if you have the ability to take a loan out, you have the ability to call your friends and family for a round or whatever, then that affords you something that some other people can't have. So you have to take, the advice from people who look like you and have similar lived experiences just as much as you take it from people who don't know anything about what you do or that you really admire that are completely different.
Yeah.
I love
Again, love all of that. I would say like, well, first of all, I'm not that into advice generally. I think that people who like tell you what you should do are always wrong. I think that people who ask you really good questions and reflect back what they hear you saying, that's good. That's what I would like to replace advice with, is folks paying attention to who you are and what you're saying, what shows up for you. So I think that's one of the big things is like, I would say don't take advice. And I think also like pretty much I would, I think that especially like the investment community is super interesting because I've learned a ton from what it means to try to pitch to investors, right? Like what it is that they're looking for and like what that story is and stuff like that. Like there's a lot that's really, really interesting in that can really craft and focus and stuff like that. But that the actual conclusions that they have are also wrong, right? Their definitions of value and like what is worthy of investment and how you use money and how the world uses money are mostly very bad. And like I would challenge a lot of those values, but I like some of those mechanisms, if that makes sense. So like the frameworks are helpful, the conclusions I think are mostly off.
Yeah, I love that. So many people with big ideas sort of gravitate towards that, like, I gotta go pitch investors and get some cash to go do some things, which can facilitate a lot of goodness. But oftentimes investors have a lens of which they're judging whether that idea is worthy of something that is maybe not be in line with your values of what you want to do with that money when you get it or something like that. And it becomes a big... The lawyers that we work with are pretty heavily involved in the startup space, and they're like, when you're fundraising, it's a full-time job, and you could also make taking care of your customers a full-time job as well. And so sometimes your customers can be good investors, and they usually give you a little bit more flexibility on how you spend that money. So I like that, Rada.
Yeah, investors aren't actually that interested in investing in something brand new, right? They actually want something that is proven and is a slight safe variation that they think will be like a new market, and that they're not ready for like actually truly disruptive, like actual out of the box ideas. And so a lot of those, if you're doing it based on what investors say, you're not going to get the best parts.
I want to hug the conversation that we got. Like, you both are great, but I just want to hug the conversation. I think I'm so thankful for both of your voice on this podcast and for the people who listen to it, because it is a bunch of people who are doing things in their own way, and it's difficult to find the blog post that kind of has this conversation in it. It's difficult to find the book that teaches you how to think about all of this stuff, and so both of you are good examples. I'm glad other people get to hear from. Appreciate it for both of you. If you're listening to this, you can pop into the show notes. All the information about where to learn more about The Darkest Horse and connect further will be there. If you listen to podcasts on a regular basis, you already know all of that. That's like a common thing to you at this point. And I definitely would recommend. We as a company have benefited greatly from The Darkest Horse work and the sort of things that they do and teach and facilitate. Our team took some big leaps forward together through bringing Chante and Rada in and helping to facilitate some conversations with us. So would recommend.
Ditto. Very ditto.
Yes, ditto.
Thank you both. Appreciate it so
Thank you.
much.
It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you.
D'Angelo, you're wonderful and you're so skilled at what you do.
I love you, Adam. I'm not going.
You can keep that part of the podcast,
Yeah, keep that part.
The intro. He's like the intro, and then just plays on the loop for an hour. I got you. Yeah, I checked it. Beautiful. That love.
I have something to fill this space though, real quick. Just if you're gonna keep it, please. Hashtag free Britney.
Yeah, when do we get to that part?
Yeah, when do we get to that part?
Columbus got on the map on for a little bit because we do a thing on July 4th called the Doodah Parade, which is it's a parade of, I don't know how you describe it. Silliness.
It's like a parade. Like if you've ever been in a inebriated state and you'd be like, I should throw a parade. That would probably be what it looks like.
So many times.
They're like, no sponsorships. If there's a politician in it, they have to wear a funny hat.
Yeah.
It's like no corporate sponsored anything, and it's like it's just we all could show up and have a float, but that is whatever we decided. They did a free Britney sort of float through the parade, and it showed up on the front pages of Reddit and things like that. I'm not often so proud of our city and the things that it like is known for, or the state of Ohio in general, and we got one up there that I was like,
You gotta
a
drop
good one.
you gotta drop that parade in the
Okay.
in the
show notes.
and in show notes and in the chat, please. I want to check it out.
Yeah, I'll get it sent over.
It's wonderful because if you happen upon it, like if you're just out and you see it, you're like, oh my god, what?
They're like some of the I don't even know the right language for describing this, but some of the tattoo studios or people who do like body modification will like be pulling a car through with like hooks in their skin. You know, it's like it is like probably the weirdest thing Columbus has going on for it, and it's well accepted, which to me is like worthy of celebration and because we're kind of boring.
And speaking of like inclusivity, they act like the Church of Satan actually does a walk, and they have on hoods and they have on stuff, but they seem like relatively swell people. I mean, my interaction with them was limited in that moment, but I'm like, someone with a smile like this,
There you go.
and is waving.
That's the kind of parade you can expect.
But that is like sort of the definition of Satan. It's like, hey, we're having fun over here.
I hear there's a lot of charm involved. Yeah.
Come on over. We got drinks, libations. We got it all.
I was just being a good human. I'm like, you guys are good humans. They're like, yes, we are.
That's like
Yes, we are.
We'll get off of that.
That's a good parade. That's a good parade. I mean, it's funny. We just put out an article on the on our blog, the blog that you all designed for us, about who belongs at Pride, right? And this question of and it's interesting. I'm not comparing the kink community to Satan worshipers directly. I am saying though that like these are categories of folks that we say like, oh, weird, you seem nice, and like, yeah, they are nice because they're also humans and we all get to make our own decisions. And like, as long as our way of showing our pride and our identities and our perspectives doesn't involve actual violence, then it's all good. Right. And there's plenty of ways to show up with those values without actually creating any kind of violence. And that's exactly what I want to see. Right. That's what pushing boundaries and exploring those questions is important. It's important to our culture. It's important to our evolution. It's important to our art, and so I'm here for it. I'm here for this doodah. Is that what's called doodah parade?
Yeah. I'll send you information about it. It is the thing that Allie and I have often thought we should invite like if we're doing like a conference or something, like if we ever did something like that with work and our network, it'd be like, let's do it around July 4th, which probably the people who don't want to do that is fine. But that was like the cultural export that I think is really unique and cool about our city. And it's so like fun and accepting. And a lot of people go to it. It's like normal, people in like khakis and polos go sit out and have a beer and watch it. And
then there's always those, there's a bunch of workout people hang out on High Street. So you're like he says, like a guy in a suit, and then you got a guy with workout people. Workout people, like a guy with a workout shirt and workout pants. You're like, yo, this is a workout person. So,
that is,
yeah. I mean, nothing.
No, it's great.
They make very nice athletes.
Well, and it's not the same as an athlete. There's a difference between an athlete and a workout person.
I've never heard that someone for Ace does that before, and I knew exactly what it meant when D'Angelo said it, and I was like, "Wow, that's."
Did you imagine the color coordinated workout?
Exactly. I was like, their outfit matches.
Totally.
But it's not a uniform.
Oh my god!
Right.
It's all Nike. Everything's Nike or Adidas.
Yeah. And they don't really have sweat on them, and they're like, if they're a woman, they may have makeup on, right? And it's like perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And they're usually decent looking people too.
And have it, yeah.
Right.
This is amazing. That's amazing. I want to get back to some of the topics that our listeners.
Oh, this wasn't what you meant for an inclusion conversation?
Well, I just don't know. I feel like I like this conversation, but I feel as if it's off track, but I like the track that it's on. But I'm going to go on to a different one because I know.
Great.